Let's invite the rest of the panel up. So, can I invite Belle Ribeiro Addy MP, Member of Parliament for Streatham, and Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations. Can I also invite Onyekachi Wambu, the Director of AFFORD, the African Foundation for Development. And absolutely not least at all, Dr. Janice Cheddi, writer and researcher on contemporary visual culture and heritage. Okay, welcome all of you, and thanks so much. Belle, you know I'm going to start with you, right? Because one of the things I was wondering during that was, that brilliant presentation was about how the all-parliamentary group is kind of looking at these issues and where you've got to. So maybe we start with you on that.
Okay, so we were really, really pleased to be able to launch in December, continuing the great work that Bernie Grant started. In order to do this, we actually had to find one Tory to agree, and we found just one. And even he doesn't really agree with us, but he believes he believes that the conversation should be had. So hats off to him, at least. And he actually got a lot of stick for it. So we're very nice to him to make sure that he comes on board next year. And the purpose of the group is to really begin a conversation and look forward to policy. And we've got a few different strands running through it. So we've got, and a few different secretariats working on those different strands. So to start with restitution, really pleased to have AFFORD on board in terms of that. And they're going to be starting looking at some evidence sessions to discuss all of the issues of restitution, and then from there we're going to be putting forward a report and some policy on that. Then we're looking forward to with Stop the Mangamese Trust, looking at community organisations that have been leading on these issues for a number of years, taking evidence from them in the style of the Truth and Justice reconciliation hearings, in that style, looking at what people are thinking when they think of reparations, looking at what the various issues are following on from slavery and colonialism. Obviously, I think it's really important to start from a starting point. Well, we understand that there is nothing, there is no amount of money, there is nothing that can be said, there's nothing that can be done that could, really repair what's happened with slavery and colonialism, really create a situation where, it completely erases what's happened. So to understand, firstly, that there's nothing that can be done that will atone for it, I think is the best place to start. But that doesn't mean there should not be attempts to. Reparations isn't a new idea, so one of the things that we are looking at is in the past where reparations have been made to different countries and different groups. It's not unusual. So for us to talk about it today and for people to throw out the ideas to us that this is ridiculous, oh, why are you doing this? Oh, one very popular one is we've already given these people so much money in aid, why should we be giving them any more? And all of these really...
Because they robbed and killed us.
Yeah.
It's quite simple, really.
These people as well was ridiculous. But and another strand is obviously not just looking at what has happened directly in terms of slavery and colonialism. That needs to be looked at in order to get a sense of what needs to be done, but also to look at the effect that it's having today. Now, the racism that all of us face in this country and the racism that is faced by black peoples across the world is a direct result of slavery and colonialism. So when we're looking at reparations, we need to look beyond the idea of just giving people money, because there is no amount of money, and also how much money, where would the money go, etc. That's all very, very confusing. So we're looking at educational reparations, we're looking at housing reparations, we're looking at environmental reparations, things like scrapping the debt of some countries that actually have paid over and over again in terms of interest, who are now suffering the serious effects of climate change and are unable to keep up these debt repayments whilst also protecting themselves against some very serious issues. I think of countries like Barbados, We're very, very clear about where they are in terms of the environment and what's going to happen if something's not done. Asking them to continue paying debt will completely reduce their ability to create a system of resilience against the effects of climate. So looking at things like that, we have to remember that Europe deliberately underdeveloped African countries, and if we're looking to repair, as the word reparations states, we need to look towards development and not development in the way that it's been done. So that's yet another strand that some of the NGOs are looking at, some of the better ones. Looking at a way, international development aid was never meant to become an industry. It has become an industry. And in order to maintain an industry, you have to maintain demand in order to supply. So if you're maintaining demand in development, you're actually keeping people in that position. And when people give money to all of these different aid organizations, it's something that I've heard David Lammy refer to, as poverty porn. You put a picture of a starving baby in Africa with flies flying around their head, and you give them a load of money. Give this, give £5, give £10. When you give that money to an organisation like Oxfam, for example, and I'll use them as an example, do you really think that you're giving money so that there can be 6 individuals living in London on 6-figure salaries? What are they doing? And in all of those years they've received their 6-figure salaries, why haven't they changed the entire world? Presumably they're receiving all of this money because they're so amazing. But what on earth is this that we're maintaining international development aid, putting them into these large companies who have to spend most of their money on operations and are not actually delivering? I'm going to stop there.
That's fantastic. We're definitely going to come back to some of those issues that you raised. I'm going to come to you next, Onyekachi, about your kind of impressions of the presentation that we've just heard.
Yeah, like you, I learned a lot. I mean, I've been with Dan on a kind of road show over the last 6 months with different events. And each time I learn a little bit more. But I think for me, in terms of my response today, one of the key things I wanted to talk about was the issue of resistance and the importance of resistance. And the Oba with Benin, there were lots of other African countries that were sacked and were destroyed, but he resisted. And in his resistance, something powerful happened. The first time I came across him was when I was still at the BBC and I was trying to make a documentary, and I went to what was then the Museum of Mankind to look at the exhibition. It wasn't in the British Museum at the time. And there was a picture of the Oba, and he had this smile on his face. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Why are you smiling? They've just destroyed your kingdom. But then it occurred to me that actually the smile was the fact that he had engaged in battle, and there was a resonance 100 years or 94 years later when I was there in the museum looking at that. So the act of resistance was important because we revisit that moment, and then we have to really look at what happened and ask all those important questions again. And then go back to the 1992, Bernie starts the African reparations movement. And there's this moment of resistance where Bernie stands up to much ridicule. And, here we are later here, and the issues are magnified again. And it's important each time that you stand up, that you make that intervention, because later on it resonates. And later on, after we did some, we were outside the British Museum with Bernie demonstrating for the return to much ridicule. I went to Bernie and said, look, yes, we can ask for reparations, yes, we can ask for the restitution, but what about the victims? We need to start a Remembrance Day. And Bernie agreed, and he was the only one of a lot of the black leaders who I went to see at the time who agreed to starting an African Remembrance Day to talking about the victims of what had happened over the last 400 years. And later on I said to Bernie, why did all the rest say no at the time? Because I saw some leaders and they all said, oh, it happened a long time ago, this stuff is over. And it wasn't over, because it was only in the last 4 years that actually the debt was eventually paid off to the slave owners by the Bank of England. But for them, it was a long time ago. And I said to Bernie, why is it that they don't want to resist, or they don't want to stand in the moment and confront these issues? And he said, oh, don't mind them. They need permission. And it was really interesting, because by 2007, when we have the Wilberforce moment, all the people who had said this was a long time ago were all there in Westminster Abbey, with the Queen and everybody else. And then I understood, because I didn't actually understand what Bernie was saying about they needed permission. But they were there in Westminster Abbey, and it was only Toyin who stood up and said that this is all nonsense in Westminster Abbey. So, credit to him. So this importance of standing up, of resisting in that moment, of being truthful, of speaking about the victims. Dan spoke about these 10 R's that I've been talking about. And the 10 R's are really the ways that these struggles return again and again and again in different forms, and there are different movements. And the R's are, the first R is kind of recognition that this stuff has happened, and we're still battling that with people in the house. Second R is remembrance of the victims. Third R is restitution of artifacts and human remains. There's so many human remains in boxes that need to go home. And some of them are still on display in the British Museum, in the mummy floor. How in the 21st century we still have human remains on display is extraordinary. And then we go from all the different R's: repair, return, the Rastas have been involved in return, reconnection within the severed African world. And in the end, the African Union have a 2063 agenda of Renaissance. So we end with Renaissance. So there are a lot of R's that need for us to look at what has happened over those 400 years and how we begin to respond to this. There was a whole other thing that I wanted to respond to, Dan, but I'll let Janice come in, just on the issue of the importance of icons, and I'm so glad he spoke about Fanon, but I also wanted to talk about, and Fanon talked about the importance of the mastery of language, because language affords us this remarkable power. And he talks about himself being endlessly creating himself. So there's this role that language has in terms of how it allows us to reinvent ourselves, to put these issues on the agenda. But also he talks about this issue of cognitive dissonance, where language itself can create, the imagination can create new possibilities, but then there's this material reality, and sometimes when the two collide, it's, you get this cognitive dissonance that he talks about. But I wanted to include alongside Fanon Toni Morrison, who is really important in this kind of discourse, and who is a master of language herself and understands the way that language itself can shape liberation, but can also imprison us. And she talks about really this idea of the moment and the function, and because ultimately what we're dealing with is the legacies of the last 400 years, and the function of racism is on one level, just she called it, the function is distraction, that it keeps you doing your work. It keeps you from explaining over and over again your reason for being. So somebody says you have no language, to quote her, you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody else says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so that you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so that you dredge that up. And then she says that ultimately none of this is necessary, because there's always one more thing to do, and what you have to be is human and actually be in the moment and create. And I would really today wanted to pay tribute to to Bernie, who stood up in '92 and created this moment that all of us, that resonates 30 years later, and all of us are now actually trying to make possible so that these artifacts can go back, so that Africans can re-engage with their past and then create new future possibilities.
Great, thank you. Janice, what are your reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to thank Dan. It was a very rich and interesting discussion. I mean, a number of points, like before I came out, I was looking at a number of policy diversity reports over the last 20 years. And one thing that struck me really was that the first one I looked at was like late 1990, like was holding up the mirror. And this was like 2 years just after the film that we saw. And looking through subsequent reports, what struck me was that the language of restitution just does not exist within there. And anybody that's done this work knows that there's a kind of like almost a dual debate. There's a debate which takes place amongst kind of black community activists, which does always talk about restitution. Where does the stuff come from? Why can't we have that conversation? But there's also a fear that you can't have that conversation with the museum professionals because they won't engage with you. And they hold all the power because they have the staff, they have the power to interpret. But what struck me is how quickly things changed, how the language of restitution and reparation is suddenly centre stage within these debates. And the reason for that is, and we've had different ways of describing it, is what Cedric Robinson calls, is the black radical tradition. It's that thing that holds on within debates within the community and carries across generations that language of creating new narratives around this stuff, new interpretive communities around how we look at that work and how we struggle to get museums to give us access to them, but also to interpret that. The fact that the stuff's in museums also raises the question around knowledge. Those artifacts aren't being researched. They aren't being, new scholarship isn't being allowed to develop. But there's also another thing about them, is that they are also signifiers of a rich, intangible cultural heritage, which we carry and live through. And the idea that happens in the museums is there are two forms of time. There is Western time, which is dynamic and changes, but somehow people outside that, in the Caribbean and Africa and other parts of the world, exist in this kind of fossilized time of where they don't have development, they don't have movement, and ideas around culture don't change. And it's those things that we really need to talk about. And we need to also talk about those intangible cultural heritage, because they carry, both in Africa they exist and they have evolved, but they've also come across within the diaspora. And we need to place back those elements of intangible cultural heritage around the artifacts as well, not just about how they were used and the materials that were used, but how they existed in a real dynamic culture, and then how they exist and speak to the cultures of today. So there is this kind of obligation that we have, both in recognising the power of the black radical tradition. And I also think we need to remember, particularly in terms of reparations and in terms of is the debt that we owe to the Rastafarian community, because it's really that Rastafarian community within the UK that has kept that drum of reparations and the debt that is owed around slavery and colonialism. And I think that the fact that those communities aren't engaged with or we don't remember the contribution they have to be made is something that we really need to think about in terms of how we talk about that black radical tradition. And the other thing that I want to say is that we cannot allow symbolic black representation to displace radical change within the kind of museum. So we can't allow, we have one black curator, which then displaces the need for fundamental change. We need to hold that tradition that we need fundamental change across the whole of the institution, around the language, around who they employ. And also we need to remember there was lots of statements made about BLM in 2020. Some of these same institutions used the pandemic, to then make large sections of their black and brown workers redundant. So we cannot divorce the two. We need to hold on to that. So I'm just going to end there. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, the question of the black radical tradition, I think is something that's far too easily forgotten. And this question of this kind of symbolic representation as well. Anyway, I think is really important because we see it every day in Parliament. Diane will see it, Belle will see it, Jeremy will see it, where the Tories try and say, well, we've got all these black people on the front bench, so we must be all right. And we see the most... I'm sorry, I'm going to get political again. But we see the most repressive... Yeah, you might as well... You should... I'm going to say it anyway. I write about it every day anyway, right? But we see the most repressive police legislation. We see the most repressive nationality laws still. And in charge of this legislation are some of these people who, frankly, should know better. But there's a whole question around that as well, whether, in fact, they should know better and whose interest they're actually representing anyway. And I think that's something that we have to remember about why we're there, what it is we're trying to do. Because, in my view, the Tories are really clear who they represent and why they are where they are. And maybe some of our folk, I think the MPs who are here know this tonight, but there are plenty of others who maybe have forgotten and maybe need to be reminded by us, perhaps. Yeah. Dan, before I get in more trouble, right? You've had a chance to have a little breather. What's your reflections on some of the things that you've heard from our other panellists?
Okay, thanks so much. So yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is thank you, everybody, for such thoughtful responses and important comments. In terms of reparations, if I can raise that first, I mean, let's remember. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful to hear that we're going to be looking at other analogies, other moments in which reparations have been paid, but let's also remember how much it's an important part of the very recent international diplomacy. I mean, look at Iran. We've just had the government accept that reparation or at least at the very least, the repayment of a historic debt is something that can happen after half a century, after 40 years, was it? Anyway, however long it was. Look at what has been happening in the conversations over environmentalism and the COP26 observation that small island states are entitled to reparation because of the effect of the environmental changes that have been caused from extractive colonialism and capitalism, that means that the sea level rises are affecting them. So it's already part of the discourse, and I think that's what's so exciting is to sort of, as we have done with restitution, we've shown that this is part of an evolution of the ethical professional practice in terms of our museums. In that, I mean, I'm old enough to remember in the 90s when it was controversial to say you would return Holocaust loot or you would return ancestral human remains. And yet the Washington Principles of 1998 underlined the fact that in the very different historical cases of Holocaust spoliation, the onus for knowing whether stolen objects were in a museum lies not with the claimant, but with the institution. We need to, so every art gallery in the world now has got a curator who is in charge of the provenance research to make sure we're not showing art that's been nicked. But that work, but why exactly the same? How come reparation isn't relevant? Is relevant in those other cases, but is not relevant for Africa and the diaspora. So too in terms of restitution. You know, how come it's been mainstream to return objects and ancestral remains to indigenous communities around the world, and to these very different historical contexts in the continent of Europe, but not to Africa. So that's exciting. I mean, I could listen to you all day about the 10 R's on Ikachi. I'd add an 11th R, which is arithmetic. And arithmetic is important because one thing...
You're like a professor.
Yeah. So arithmetic's important because we need to know where these objects are. So one thing that my book did for the first time was attempt to create a list of where we think all the Benin objects are, and then we can begin to count them up. But we need to do that for so many other contexts as well. So that transparency in terms of numbers and actually adding up what's out there in terms of the human remains. How many individuals from the continent of Africa, from empire as a whole, are represented in our museums in this country? I don't know, 100,000 individuals or 200,000? We don't know. It's shameful. There was a report there was a DCMS report in 2003, which is so incomplete and patchy. I think if you add up the numbers in there, you get to about 60,000. But there are significant, well-known and large institutions that simply didn't respond at that time. And we're now 20 years sort of down the line from that. And so that's important. And then, in terms of, as a final point, Toni Morrison, all of the quotations that you gave are incredibly important. I happen to be reading, actually because of this weird complaint that Morrison is being taught to undergraduates at Stirling, even though the Jane Austen texts that supposedly have been cancelled are continuing to be taught at undergraduate level. I happened to go back last night, actually, to her Nobel acceptance speech, where she has this incredible line about someone asking her if the bird in her hand is dead, in her hands is dead. And the reply is, I don't know if it's dead, but it's in your hands. And then there's a repeat of that, it's in your hands. And I think that hopeful side to Morrison's writing as well, that what may or may, are these things, how is violence and loss and killing, how does it live on in the present? How is part of this work about conscience, about how to remember the dead, how to remember loss, how to remember, as I was talking to an artist the other week, how to remember the sort of loss when you don't even know what's been lost. It's the loss of knowledge, it's the loss of names. When at these wonderful events for the return of the items from France to Benin, in the exhibition they're holding which opened a couple of months ago, and there was this great, so the French were concentrating on this. They had this great sad exhibition about, we're losing these objects from the museum in sort of Paris. Then a month later, this incredible moment of celebration with the images of the objects on the side of buses and in the streets and all of the events that were held to celebrate the return. But the questions being asked were, we don't know what languages to address these ancestral objects in. What language should we use? So part of what's been taken is knowledge as well as objects. And that's why the work of restitution and repair it's that sense that the return of the object is only the beginning.
Thanks. And I suppose before I kind of open it up for some Q&A, I suppose the question that I want to ask each of you, so we'll just work along basically, is, I'm an organiser and I always ask, well, so what's next? What are we asking people to do? What's the ask? So from your perspective, each of you, what is the ask? What are we asking folks here to do? What are we asking politicians to do? What are we asking the wider community to do? So let's just work across. Janice, do you want to kick us off?
I think there should be a general knowledge that most of this stuff is not held in the British Museum or National Museums. It's actually held in your local museum. I think an immediate ask would be to ask museums local to you what is held in your museums in terms of, and do you actually know where it is? So that would be my first ask for the people in this room, yeah.
You can have another ask if you've got one.
My other ask, I think, is that going back to the Black radical tradition, is that we need to preserve and collect the material of those organisations, so we have a record of what was being done. It's not enough to have, once in a while BBC documentary, because that doesn't tell you. We need to know, because it's about everyday people who step out of their lives and to do very amazing things, and most of the time they did that for nothing. But we need to know what that tradition is, what it looks like, and the lessons that we learn for that. And the other thing I think we need to remember, that it was a radical tradition in terms of that it was inclusive, and it developed a radical solidarity, not just based on a single agenda. Thank you.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of add to that, really, and just go back to Fanon, who said a number of things. The first, really importantly, in terms of the ask, is that he kind of urged each generation to discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. And I think in terms of what Janice is saying about that radical tradition, there are people who did that and identified what some of the key issues were. And there is a tradition that we need to all step up to. And I know we've had sort of 30 years of neoliberalism, but I think perhaps we're going to be snapping out of that fairly shortly, so we need to get back to core fundamentals. And then he made another big statement, which is back in I think it was the Wretched of the Years, which is the basic confrontation, which seemed to be colonialism versus anti-colonialism, indeed capitalism versus socialism, he says, is already losing its importance. And what matters, as has always mattered, is the need for redistribution of wealth. And, let's get back to the fundamentals. And that humanity will have to address this question, no matter how devastating the consequences may be. So I think it's those big order things that Janice is talking about in terms of that progressive agenda, the alliances that we make, and we're about to undergo a huge moment globally, and how we reach out to each other to come through this moment, in terms of the inequalities that are going to be accelerating, in terms of all these big issues that are once more going to be confronting us in the West, are going to be important. And I think, a lot of people have spoken, the reasons that we're having this conversation at the moment is that we are ending that period of 500 years of Western dominance, and there's going to be this renegotiation in terms of the role of Africans within that creation of that Atlantic space, the ways that we have been marginalized within that space, and these big issues that we're debating, and the alliances that we're going to need to have a proper renegotiation of that as the world changes. So for me, the ask is more on that level. Yes, we're doing the work on the icons, we're doing the work on reparations with Bell, but I think those broader questions are going to be really important and for us to address again. I know Jeremy over there tried to do that, and we hoped that he would have made the impact at the last election, but the country decided at that point it wasn't ready. But as Fanon says, you don't give up, and we keep fighting for that. So I'll pass on to Belle.
I definitely say in terms of ask when the calls come, answer. So one of the things that some local areas have done, some local authorities, starting with my own Lambeth, is to pass motions through their local council. And I know it's been done in Bristol as well, to look at the local area and its individual links to the slave trade and start discussion amongst local residents about what we should potentially rename. And now there's been a lot of debate about that, you know, the erasure of history and such things. But there are many different ways to preserve said history and explain it. We just have to make people understand that when you put things up, when you name things after people, you are essentially glorifying them. And also pointing back to the fact that it's not like we don't change the names of things in this country at all. Every time the Queen has a jubilee, and she has a lot of them, we change the name of something to celebrate her. So it's not that people then don't remember what it was called before because it's written down in history, but it's not unusual to change the name of something. So just normalising the idea that we're not taking anything away. Engage in some of the discussions that will be coming up in terms of restitution, in terms of reparations. And again, when that call does come in terms of changing the law, again, these museums hiding behind the law have also forgotten that literally it's our job to change the law. The Conservatives at the moment said they don't like migrants, so they're changing the law. We could say we don't like the Museums Act, so we're going to change the Museums Act. All of these things are perfectly tangible and possible if we're able to campaign and also put pressure on the members of Parliament that vote on these pieces of legislation. So all of these things are changeable. I think we definitely need to start with that, engaging in the conversation and lobbying those people in power to make the change that's necessary for us to move forward.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a few moments where you get an opportunity to ask some questions. We've got 2 microphones either side of me. So instead of somebody walking around and offering you a microphone, I'm going to ask you if you've got a question or a short contribution to make, and a mean short contribution. I know what you like, right? I know, because I know what I'm like, because I do the same. Microphone, grab it, use it. So you have an opportunity, come down and please make your contribution, but say your name. And if you've got a particular question for a particular person, please say so as well.
So, Roger, whilst they're walking over, I forgot to say, join in the call for an apology for slavery and colonialism and everything that's followed after. One of the major issues that we've had is not being able to secure an apology. And people have said that's quite symbolic, doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it starts with an acceptance of guilt and acceptance that something has gone wrong. And at the moment, failing to accept that has meant that we haven't followed through with the reparations that are meant to happen. So, for example, we've had deep expressions of regret, people being deeply sorrowful. I was deeply regretful that Woolworths closed down. Deeply, no, but it's true that, I mean, you cannot equate regret and sorrow to you know, the degradation and dehumanization of millions of people. So it needs a proper apology, and we want people to join in that call.
Look, I see there's a fair queue. Right, so I really need you all to be really disciplined about the length of your contributions, please, but we're going to start over here.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, just wanted to say thank you very much so far. My name is Juliet, and I wanted to say... Hello, hi. I wanted to say 2 quick things. I heard the welcome to the various people here. I just want to make one other welcome. Bernie's siblings are here. Now, we've got Rosamond. Hand up, Rosamond. We've got Leyland. Hand up, Leyland. We've got Waveney. Hand up, Waveney. And we've got Efwa. Hand up. These are his brothers and sisters. Sadly, his mother and father are not here, but they were also, they're the reason that Bernie is Bernie. I just wanted to say that very quickly. The other point I very quickly wanted to make is the where next. I'm going to steal Dan's R for arithmetic, because I am the chair of the Huntley Archives. When Black Lives Matter started, and when there was the statues that were being pulled down and so on, the DCMS wrote to virtually every single black-owned museum or creative group, asking them and reminding them of where this came from. Okay? That's the arithmetic. That's the what next. We have to be able and in a position to fund our own things. Otherwise, we're always at the beck and mercy of the DCMS. That's the point I want to make. I'm gone.
Thank you. From this side, next. And my apologies, I didn't realise the family were here, so my apologies for that. And hi, good to see you all.
It was in this very hall in 2019 we launched the Race and Faith Manifesto, which brought in a whole lot of things about education, emancipation, trust, and a number of other issues surrounding education. What I'd like to hear from Dan and others taking this forward is how we change the education curriculum in our school and change the whole attitudes that go with teaching of history in our schools. Children aren't born racists. They grow up racists because of the environment in which they live, the pressures they're put under, the media that characterizes people in particular ways, and also this notion of European supremacy, which is inculcated in them in the study of history. And Remy Kappa and many others' books on the way in which the slave trade survived was all about the notion of racial superiority. And so we have to challenge that. And so in taking down statues, in sending the relics back to where they ought to be on display, that's a very important and huge step. The next step is to change the way our history is taught and education is taught, so children grow up understanding the brutality of what European colonialism was and the wonderful breadth of knowledge and ideas that came from every part of this globe that we all benefit from. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Diane?
My name's Diane. Very short, Roger, very short. First of all, I thought it was a great presentation and a great lecture by Professor Dan Hicks. And like a lot of people, I thought I knew the subject, but I learned a lot of things I didn't know. And I thought, yeah, all the panelists are great. I was particularly impressed with the member for Streatham. But, what I wanted to say, earlier this evening, I was at a meeting about Child Q. You're going to say to me, Child Q, what's that got to do with museums and artifacts and so on? And as you know, this was a poor child who was strip searched in the most degrading way in a Hackney school, not so far from here. But obviously, there's the role of the police, but I don't need to come to Tottenham to talk about institutional racism in the police, right? But I was thinking about the teachers. Now, I don't actually know any of those teachers, but I know a bit about Hackney teachers, and I can tell you now what they were like. They were people who would consider themselves liberal, not talking about their voting, they consider themselves liberal and advanced. They would tell you they went on an anti-Nazi League march once. Maybe they even had sex with a black person, who knows, right? But those teachers, in colluding at degrading that young girl in that way, and she's a Rasta actually, by the way, Rasta family, those teachers felt able to collude in degrading that girl because as far as they're concerned, liberal as they are, nice as they are, black people have no culture that they have to respect. No culture they have to respect. We are not fundamentally, they'll be nice to us, but we're not fundamentally on the same footing as them. And that's why this work is so important. It's so important because unless we can sort of resurrect our culture and put it up there on a footing with white culture, get the respect that it deserves, then you know it may seem a complex connection, but horrors and degradations just happen to that poor 15-year-old in a Hackney school will continue to happen.
I'm Dr. Keith Flett. I do a number of things, but in this capacity, I'm the convener of the Socialist History Seminar at the Institute of Historical Research, which is the home of research history in the UK, based at Senate House at the University of London. And we've been there for almost 30 years now. It's quite a struggle to get in. There's no other existing seminar or gathering there that looks at socialist or left-wing history in the way that we focus on entirely. But the point in terms of tonight, of course, is the struggle here goes much wider than formal academic history, thankfully. But I would say that what we're hearing tonight, what we're talking about tonight, does not echo much in the corridors and the seminar rooms of the Institute of Historical Research, even now. Not absent, but it's not something that's centrally discussed. And I think there's a job to do there for those of us that are still working, at least partly in my case, in the academy, to try and make sure that there is more visibility, more research, and more work generally done in this area than has been the case. So not that there's no work, there's quite a bit of work, but in terms of the visibility of it, in those kind of, the home of research history in the UK, it's not there as it should be. So there's still there's a much wider struggle, which in many ways is more important, but there's still that struggle there to get those ideas and these points we're hearing made in that location.
Thank you. Right, we've literally got a couple of minutes, so sister, you're next, and if the person on this side can be ready as well to go. But I really need people to be as brief as possible.
Okay, I'll be brief. My name is Ariel. I'm a recent graduate from SOAS. I just did an MA, and my work was centered around reinterpretation, like the young lady here mentioned. And I'm just going to read my question to be quick. So it says, if institutions don't want to hear or promote reinterpretations of descendants of West African slaves, such as I, who does want to give young creatives and young writers the opportunity to work in the field of reinterpretation or academia? And how do we find that support? And I work a little analogy like the lanterns in the tunnel. I'm finding it kind of difficult to be celebrated in these fields, and I was wondering if you guys have any advice about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, I'm going to, sadly, not much time, so one from this side, and then Glenroy from that side.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm at UCL, and so in terms of your local, the British Museum is actually my local institution. And so my question is kind of aimed at Dan, but anyone, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. In cases where objects are kind of not returned, how do you think museums can change the way that they display their objects to reflect efforts of restitutions? And sort of more specifically, how can Universal Survey museums be of value in a dialogue that they kind of weren't really built to engage in the first place?
Thank you. Gwen.
Yes, greetings.
Sorry, these are the last one. This is the last one now, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Yes, greetings. My name is Glenroy Watson from Global African Congress. Can I say thank you, Kechi, for reminding us about Toyin's contribution to this struggle. Dan, you used the word a couple of times, extravagators or something like that. I mean, is that a new name for thieves? Because these are people who obviously stole the treasurers. But I wonder whether, in fact, how will liberal in the UK respond to what I think is going to happen with the next generation? They will no longer be asking for these things to be returned. They will be kicking down the doors and taking them. And I just wonder how we can help and make sure we support those people, because you did ask for an ask. My ask is that we must support the effort to get those back by any means necessary. Thank you.
Okay, my sincerest apologies for all those who couldn't get in to ask their question. We're going to ask the panel just really briefly, just to answer any of the points that have been raised, but don't feel you have to answer all of them. I'm going to start over this side, actually. So, Janice, I'm going to start with you.
To the young lady who was talking about entering the museum profession, there are lots of people of colour working in museums who are organising and creating pathways, so I would definitely get in contact with them. Personally, because I come from a visual arts background, the most interesting reinterpretation is being done by black and brown artists, and who are using digital media, video, film, spoken word to talk about those artifacts. And the importance for me is that it talks about the emotional resonance that those artifacts have with us, and how we carry them and the memory of them within our intangible heritage culture. So that would be another avenue I think you need to explore. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was going to respond to the question about the British Museum and how to relate to the objects on display. I was just going to say that I think we're involved in all the stages of grief around this issue. So there's some people who are still in denial about this, and they're in the museum sectors and the cultural sectors. And then there are others who are going through anger that they're being challenged, and then others, all along the stage to, people like Dan and others who have gone through the acceptance in Glasgow today who now want to return. So we have to be engaged in the battle at each stage of that struggle. And while we're waiting for the Museum Act to change, and we'll be working on that, there's stuff that we can do at the British Museum in terms of how the stuff is displayed. There was an earlier ask that came up, before we went to the audience Q&A. And one of the big ones that I would say to you is to engage with the British Museum to stop displaying human remains. Those are high-ranking African officials from our classical civilization in Egypt. Why are they on display? And I think all of us here can be engaged in that to demand, while we want the objects returned in the long term, in the meantime, we can actually begin that campaign to stop human remains being on display. The first act that archaeologists and others who do this work do when they want to talk about human civilization is when they find burial sites of people who have been buried in human history from 20,000 years ago. And we denote that as an act of civilization. So why we are still doing that in the present day in the British Museum is, I just think it's outrageous. So, in terms of an act that we can do together, we can begin that process. The Museum Act, we've got what is it now, 78, 79 Tory majority, 80. So it's, that's the long haul, but the things we can do in the short term.
Thank you so much. Belle?
Thank you. Just following on from that, speaking about what museums could do if they were to return things, actually they can do what they do in some instances where they use replicas, or with countries that they respect, they pay to loan the object from them for a period of time. It doesn't belong to you, pay to rent it, like other people do, but you would only do that, obviously, if you respected that country. And that goes to the Right Honourable Member for Hackney's comment about respect, and of course she is absolutely always right. And until we have that equality and that parity, that these things continue. Just to recognise what Jeremy Corbyn said about education, and what was done in this hall when Jeremy's campaigning to be the Prime Minister of the country was actually a crime that he wasn't, because what people don't know is that many of you may have signed a parliamentary petition at some point in time, and collectively, over about 4 or 5 different petitions, the subject matter to receive the most signatures in the parliamentary petitions history is for Black history to be taught in schools. And people don't know that. So there's been a conversation amongst black and white people right across the country that black history should be taught in schools. And instead, our government, fronted up again by a black equalities minister, is telling us that we need to have a model history curriculum that doesn't berate white people for the past, but recognises that a different narrative. We have to tell a different story about slavery and colonialism as if there was some sort of pleasure cruise. And one of the reasons why I say it was a crime that Jeremy wasn't elected at the time, because Jeremy was prepared to apologise for slavery and colonialism. And what a major thing that would have been, to apologise. Absolutely, for a British Prime Minister to apologise for the slave trade, that would have been so key and would have begun what was discussed in this very hall, as he said, a whole commission looking at reparations. But so the fight continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Dan, just couple of minutes.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for all of those amazing interventions and thoughts. In terms of extractivism, extractivist colonialism, I hope that's not a euphemism. The idea of extraction is so important because it links stolen art to stolen land, to stolen environments, to stolen culture. And it's that linking up of these conversations of environmentalism, of anti-racism, of the reparations and the restitution movement that I think so important. That issue of the telling of history of this big sort of Queen Victoria-sized sort of gap we have in our national historical consciousness, where maybe we think of abolition and emancipation, and then what else in terms of international history? Maybe the Crimean War is on people's minds at the moment, but basically we're then on to the First World War. And yet in every year of Victoria's reign, there were wars across the continent of Africa and across, India and so forth. What we miss, I think the hope is, as we're joining these conversations up, is that we can look not only at the extractivist histories, but the carceral nature of the capitalist histories we're looking at. Because maybe museums were simply a short aberration in a history of locking things up and people up from enslavement through quite soon, almost immediately, to the museum and objects being locked up, and then to mass incarceration, actually after the Second World War. And those carceral histories that are being explored by a number of African American historians actually at the moment help us think about the different forms that racism takes and help us join up those historical conversations. Fundamentally for us in this country, it's about remembering that the payments that happened at emancipation were not made to those people who were the victims of enslavement. They were made to the perpetrators. They were made to to the ruling class. My final thing in terms of something to do is, if you're anywhere near St Paul's Cathedral, you've still got time until the middle of May to see the work that we installed on the eve of the 125th anniversary of the attack upon Benin, which is a major work by the leading Nigerian artist Victor Ekamenor. It's a 12-foot high image of an oba. It's in the crypt of St Paul's alongside a memorial to Harry Rawson, who led that attack. And it's the kind of thing that fundamentally, maybe a point to end on, fundamentally this is about remembering or refusing that idea that African art is in the past. So much of the most important art in the world right now is being made in the continent of Africa. And so part of the space that we're opening up through Restitution has to be to celebrate and to commission the work of African artists. And in that case, I was so happy that Art Fund have actually given us a major grant to be able to acquire that work for the Pit Rivers. So this is also about the purchase of art rather than the taking of it. So that's on at St Paul's until the middle of May.
Thank you. Can I ask you all to join me in thanking all of our panellists for what I think has been a really interesting evening. And can I remind you all that the asks that we talked about are not just for here, for you to hear about. They're things for you to go away and do. It's really, really important that we don't see these sorts of events as just being things where we just kind of receive stuff. But hopefully it's what I got from Bernie all those years ago was I got an inspiration, same inspiration that I get from Diane every time, and I get from Jeremy, that it's time to stand up and do something. That we can't just keep on talking about this stuff, that we really must do something to make sure that we make that difference. And one of the ways that you can make the difference, and here's another ask, is we need your money. You knew it was going to come at some point this evening, right? So the Bernie Grant Trust doesn't just operate on thin air. We need people to support the trust. And I don't know if this is going to work, but I was told there was going to be a QR code going up on the thing at some point. I don't know. Obviously not. Not happening. Okay, well, you can donate to the Bernie Grant Trust by www.berniegrantarchive.org.uk. Have you got leaflets? I don't know, because there's QR codes on that. No? None of this works, but anyway. So give us your money now you've cheered, right? There's no point in cheering unless you're going to donate. So I'm going to move out the way so those of you with phones can do the business and donate so that we can get on with the work of making sure that we don't just put on one-off events like a lecture every year, but we can get on and raise some of the issues that Bernie was so passionate about, and that we can go out and educate and organise and agitate within the community as well to make sure that we make a real fundamental and lasting difference. Okay? Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, safe journey home. We'll see you out there campaigning. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.